Edgar Casey was a sincere person, but I think his stenographer was his handler. William Lyne talks about questionability about the Edgar Casey readings, considering the fact that they were the Association for Research and Enlightenment is so close to the FBI headquarters in Langley, Virginia. And I think William Lyne makes a pretty strong case on how we can be manipulated without us realizing it. But in my personal experience, I have discovered it's a little complicated in terms of how we are handled. And there are, the gullible public, like you and me, and then there are handlers, and there are informants, and a few other specialized positions. And so usually the one who is being handled does not know he is being handled. He's chosen due to his or her naivety, a capacity for naivety. So I think that's what happened. Edgar Casey was sincere about what he did, truly believed what he was told he was doing, because he didn't know he was talking in his trance state. He only knows what he was told by the stenographer and others, who supposedly took down what he said. So the fact that we don't have an audio recording is quite telling. Even though they could have made one. Edison invented the phonograph record, so, Anyway, and eventually they had enough money to pay for a phonograph recording device, if they wanted to. So, but Edgar Casey did say one thing. That I studied him as as an adolescent, and he did say something interesting. So I think what happened is that the Edgar Casey Foundation was a channel of information in which the FBI, they collect information, and then they leak out small bits of it to the public for our benefit when they feel that we, feel like sharing, because it's really up to them. It's kind of like the Vatican, only less of a stronghold. I don't know if, to me, from what little I know, the Vatican keeps all its knowledge to itself, while in our culture, we're a little more transparent, not much more, so that we get a little sharing because we expect progress. While in the old world, they don't. They just expect status quo is maintained. So that might be why the difference. The public demands progress. And so consequently, because we demand it and expect it, a little gets leaked out once in a while, long after it's already been discovered by those who hold on to it. Anyway, focusing on Edgar Casey, he did say something interesting. He said that the body only needs 4 elements: water, salt, soda, iodine. Anybody who would tell you otherwise does so out of ignorance for a price, or confusion, something like that. The quote runs something like that. And I thought that very significant, because at the time I had been studying the 3 gunas and Purusha, being a meditator, started meditation when I was 16, had my first introductory lecture into TM when I was 15, and when I started to experience Purusha by transcending Samadhi, and then studying the 3 gunas as the Bhagavad Gita talks about them, and it became very obvious to me what those 4 elements that Edgar Casey embody or represent archetypically. Water represents Purusha, because we oftentimes, in biblical sense, either water or fire represents spirit. So that's Purusha, is the water. And you have to look at it in terms of each system. You can't mix systems and try to translate. So you have to stick to the system and stay focused. So in that system of 4 elements, as a universe unto itself, because it is complete as a universe unto itself in its own limited way, it's not imbalanced, it's not missing anything. So water represents Purusha, the unmanifest, while the other 3 elements represent the manifestation of creation. Salt represents Rajas, Rajoguna, which is the most important guna, because it has to do with pressure. When you deal with a sine wave, the rise of a wave, the rise of pressure over time, has to do with Rajas, pressure, because mobility is based on pressure. Now, pressure is a combination of opposites, of sattva and tamas in a combined state, and it creates friction and heat, which is pressure. manifesting as rajas. But rajas is most important because it has to do with the yang. Rajas is equivalent to yang, creativity, activity. But sattva and tamas are the two phases of the dip of a wave having to do with yin. So yin is split into two parts, the descending part of yin and the ascending part of yin. The descending part is tamas, the rising part of yin is sattva. And then the whole half, the positive half of a sine wave is rajas, or yang. Creativity versus the dip, which is intelligence. The darkness, the receptivity. So salt represents rajas because that's pressure. It raises blood pressure. It's pretty obvious. Tamas, which follows after that, is the third significant item, and that has to do with soda in that scheme that Edgar Cayce has presented to us. Sattva, the last element of the four, is represented by iodine, the progressive element. Now, what's the next thing I was going to mention? Oh, shoot. Try and remember. Well, as I'm trying to remember, there's a corollary, and that is, when you transcend during meditation, you don't know the benefit you've gotten out of Purusha until you come back into activity, into the field of the relative, into the field of the three gunas. That's when you compare your experience now versus then. But in the break between the two, when you contacted Purusha during samadhi, you don't know you've gained samadhi. You don't know you've gained higher consciousness. You only appreciate that fact when you come out of that restful state. So in the three phases of the gunas, at the bottom of the trough, the nadir, that's when the greatest rest is attained, the least activity is maintained, the opposite of rajas, and that's when change is most likely to occur. The most greatest change being transcendence, samadhi, the experience of Purusha. But the appreciation of that change is not appreciated until the complete zenith opposite, at the rise of rajas, in the flush of activity. That's when we realize that the peak of one rajasic wave versus comparison to the prior peak, we compare the two peaks and we see, oh, there's a little change here. Life is a little more blissful, or a little more enjoyable, or a little more smooth, a little more easy, or a little more intelligent, or whatever. It's at the peak of the wave that we appreciate what happens at the lowest point of the wave. And of course, change is greatest as either the wave is rising or falling, and it's most stable either at the very nadir or at the very zenith. So it's related to the four seasons, what we go through with the four seasons. I'm trying to remember what I forgot. Anyway, I'll have to move on. There was another corollary I wanted to state. So now I can take what I've learned as a child, as an adolescent, young adult, and relate it to my study of silver. And there are two expressions. One is the healing salve, and the other is the bath recipe. We'll start with the healing salve, because the healing salve actually has two uses, because there are two skins. We learned in biology class in high school that an amoeba develops a digestive tract, a very rudimentary digestive tract, by creating a dimple on one side of the amoeba's surface. And then it goes all the way through and out the other end, and now we've got the beginning of an alimentary canal, the beginning development of a digestive system. But that outer skin had to be dimpled inward to create the inner skin. So when Hulda Clark says that it's most difficult to get rid of parasites inside the eyeball and inside the gut, what she's referencing with respect to the gut is that when we reference food inside the gut, we're actually referencing food outside our physiology, which has yet to be absorbed and may never be absorbed. It may turn into poop and leave the back end in a semi-decomposed state, or a very decomposed state, because we failed to digest everything, to absorb everything. So something got left over, and the bacteria started working on it. Some of it, the good bacteria, lactobacilli, some of it, the not-so-good bacteria, the yeast. And so it becomes foul-smelling depending on how much yeast we have going on there. If we don't have too much, then it shouldn't smell bad at all, because it's all for the most part, lactobacillus breaking it down. And the smell, do you smell an odor when you stick your nose over a container of yogurt, you know? There's not a whole lot of smell there. But over a bottle of beer that you open up, yeah, wine, yeah, you smell something all right, because that's the yeast. So the same thing happens in our gut, but inside our gut is really outside our body. So the same healing salve that we can apply to a wound outside the body, or on the surface of the penis, if I'm trying to, that's where I'm headed here, if I'm trying to develop a foreskin that was cut away at birth, the same healing salve, I should be able to ingest it. Now my first healing salve, or my first beeswax salve that I made using a recipe online, or excuse me, on YouTube. If I can get this lid open with one hand. And the white you see here is coconut oil. So I used coconut oil as my choice of oil, and then it called for beeswax, borax, and water. And you heated it up and it became emulsified. Now I've learned I don't have to emulsify the oil, because I don't have to add water. Because I can add, oh, the other thing is this has in there is silver particles, because I didn't use straight water, I used colloidal silver water, and the silver came out of solution and precipitated into quite large-sized particles, I might add. That's the advantage of making this new recipe of healing salve, is that any large-sized particles of silver that might form in a cloudy version of colloidal silver get broken up as they spin around. Apparently, molecules of beeswax come off the beeswax and get suspended, dispersed, diffused throughout the water. And that breaks up the silver molecules. I guess because they bounce around and hit up against the beeswax molecules and get stuck to them and break apart. At any rate, they go back to a very microfine consistency with no large particles, which is pretty cool. So it's a good technique. This morning I tried to make a new recipe to a healing salve. If I can get this one open. And this is basically a ball of beeswax that I made from shavings that I rolled up into a ball that had silver particles embedded in it. You know, I shaved it off with a potato peeler off the bar of beeswax. After I stuck the beeswax bar at the bottom of the beaker and I let the water spin around, be stirred around for hours, bombarding the sides of the beeswax bar with the murky, cloudy colloidal silver, taken way beyond 15 parts per million. We're talking probably 1,000, who knows, you know. So what I did was I took that ball and I put it in the bottom of a small ceramic bowl, this one, and I put the bowl inside my crock pot. No water in the crock pot, just the bowl and the ball of wax with the silver particles embedded in it. And I took my butter knife and I scooped out some of my prior candy making recipe that I have left over. It's the oil beeswax combination with maple sugar and sunflower lecithin. And, you know, despite the fact that sugar is not something you want to put on a wound, I wouldn't mind eating it though. I won't mind eating it. But it's not something you want to put on a wound because it encourages yeast. And yeast encourages infections. So I want to use it up though. I got a lot of it. So I put that in the bowl along with salt. Because what I learned recently from my botulism experience is that it was very difficult to eat beeswax in large enough quantity, despite the fact that I had healing silver in it. You would think if I was motivated I would eat as much as I need, but I lost the salivation. That's the problem with antifreeze poisoning. It really affects our motivation to eat and drink. And so I needed salt and I needed oil to get me to eat the beeswax ball of silver in adequate quantity to completely kill off the botulism food poisoning that I got from eating a spoiled can of okra that I got from, I won't say where, maybe I've said it already, and all I did was taste it. I didn't even eat it. Anywho, so I melted those 4 ingredients because I learned that if I ate salty chips with the ball of silver beeswax, I was able to get as much silver beeswax down as I needed to get down. The salt and the greasy chips, and it wasn't really greasy, it was mildly greasy, but the oil and the salt really did the job. Now we consider that to be junk food, but in reality, I've now decided that those two ingredients have to be added to silver beeswax to make it a healing salve, a complete recipe. And this is a little on the hard side. No, it's soft. I may be able to use this. I may have to add more oil, though. It's not greasy enough. Because I added an oil beeswax blend, I'm adding more beeswax rather than just oil, and so this is a little on the hard side. So I suspect I have to add more oil. So I'm going to reheat this. But I want to tell you about the 3 gunas in Purusha. Because what happens is that when we make this recipe of healing salve with these 4 ingredients, it turns out that I'm embodying the same 4 archetypes as Edgar Cayce had embodied in his admonition that all we need is water, salt, soda, and iodine, and we don't need anything else. Well, in the case of the healing salve, the beeswax represents Purusha, what would have represented water in Edgar Cayce's example. The salt represents salt, that's the same. The silver represents the iodine, the progressive element. And the oil represents tamas, stability, because oil in Ayurveda is used to calm down a vata dosha. That's somebody who's skinny, who thinks a lot, very intellectual, worries a lot, calms down the vata dosha to make it more calm. And so people who are the opposite of vata, they have a lot of kapha dosha, they tend to be fat and easygoing and jovial and jocular and calmer because they have a lot of oil in their body, and they also have a lot of water too, but also a lot of oil. So those are the same 4 expressions, but in the form of a healing salve that can be put apparently on a wound. And that's what my next experiment is going to be. I'm going to put it, if you think that this wrinkle, if you take this wrinkle to be the crease, let's say just below the corona of the head of the penis, of a circumcised penis, the scar line. So I'm going to I'm going to add a little more oil and beeswax mixture to soften this up. I'm going to remelt it again. And then what I do is I take the bowl. I made a mistake trying to take the bowl out of the crockery pot, and I managed to almost spill the contents. So I'm just going to take the whole thing out, put it here, and then I stir it constantly with the knife, the butter knife, as it cools and solidifies. And then I can spoon it out with the end of the knife and put it in a small container. Well, I got plenty of room here to add more beeswax oil combination. So it's a little on the hard side. It could be a little softer. So I'm going to remelt it and redo it. And then I'm just going to scoop the remains out with my finger from the bowl and eat the remains, because it's edible. And that's what I did with the prior lotion that I got off of YouTube that I showed you, the white one. I ate that too. I put it in a nut butter recipe with cocoa powder and sugar, and it wasn't bad. It kind of tasted weird because it had the borax in there. So I determined, I got to make things differently, but I never made another batch because I didn't have any idea. The slightest inclination to speculate. Well, now I don't have to speculate. Now I've learned what my next batch will be, and here it is. I'm starting to make it. So those are the 3 gunas in Purusha. And Purusha is like the 4th guna because it represents the transcendental, absolute, unmanifest, from which the 3 gunas arise. So you could say there are 4 gunas. So that's the expression in the form of a healing salve that can be eaten and put on a wound. Oh yeah, so I was talking about where I'm going to put it. So let me zoom in on my fake penis here. Ooh, a little too close. Okay. So, if this last digit is the head of my penis and this wrinkle is the scar line, I'm going to put it below the scar line about that wide around the penis. A band all around the circumference. I'm not going to do the head, and I'm not going to do the shaft, because if I expect growth of a foreskin to occur, it will occur where I still have retained nerve sensitivity, which just happens to be at and slightly below the scar line. So there's still a little foreskin left remaining. I can tell because of the sensitivity there. And that's where I want to encourage regeneration. So that's where I'm going to put the healing salve, not anywhere else. And then I'm going to take the corner of a sandwich baggie. I cut out, these are the flip-lock sandwich baggies. I'm going to cut out a corner, well, I've already cut them out, in the shape of a quarter circle. and that creates a conic section, basically, just enough to cover the head of my penis and slightly beyond it. I might have to cut a little wider if I'm going to be oiling below the scar line of the corona. This is the template I use. This is 3 inches on one side, 90-degree angle, and then 3 inches on this side. So it might have to be 3.5 inches. And so I use the same template. I just cut beyond it slightly if it's too small. So that'll go on top of the penis, covering the head. So the head will be slightly moist from perspiration, but the most of the moisture is going to be below the scar line. And then my underwear, my picante underwear, Pikante, I'm using the small size. I'm using the size that fits me, not one size too larger. And I cut out the balls because that's too small. And I cut out the string that goes from the sheath that would have gone across the balls. The hem line. It's not a string, it's more like a hem, but it feels like a string. It slices down the middle of the balls. I don't like that. So I just have two strings on either side of the balls, and then the sheath, the penis sheath that goes over the penis, and that will hold the plastic baggie in place, more or less. Sometimes it pops off, so I put it back on. It's kind of, having this arrangement covering the head of my penis all the time is kind of like having a foreskin, because if the foreskin is not too tight, if it's even slightly on the loose side, it can inadvertently, shall we say, retract behind the corona and get caught there. And so boys with penises very often will be pulling on that to try to get it to go forward again, because you don't want the head uncovered, rubbing against clothing. It's disgusting. Even now, I have enough sensitivity, I don't like it. So I like to keep it covered. So that's talking about the 4 gunas of the healing salve, and what I'm going to do with this healing salve. I don't have a current wound, but I'm hoping, because Becker talked about salt as an agent of debridement, he does mention that in his book, The Body Electric, so I'm hoping that the salt component actually helps encourage healing, because it helps challenge the body to heal in a nice way, because salt is the main mineral element of the bloodstream. So it's in keeping with our physiology. So that's what I'm going to use it for. And I'm going to eat it too. So the other expression of the 4 gunas is the bath mixture. And thinking it over, it doesn't take much to figure out that the bath salts I put in, although they're not salt, they're my version, my choice of what salt to put in the bath. Epsom salt and sodium bicarbonate, a very small quantity of sodium bicarbonate, but mostly Epsom salt. That represents the salt, the Rajoguna. The water of the bath represents the water that Edgar Cayce mentioned, or the beeswax of the healing salve for that matter. The MSM, I suspect, is the tamas, tamaguna, represented by oil in the healing salve, or soda, which I take to be baking soda that Edgar Cayce had mentioned. See, that's why you can't cross-correlate elements of a system out and by taking them out of the context of the system in which they reside, because they all have to do relativistically to each other in that system. So whereas baking soda is my minor salt here, soda, represented by either sodium carbonate or sodium bicarbonate, represents the tamas element in Edgar Cayce's scheme, but here I have it as a minor ingredient representing the Rajoguna in my bath salt scheme. So that's why you have to always interpret elements of a system within the context of the system and never interpret them archetypically, at any rate, outside the system in which you find them. You leave them in the system where they are if you're trying to understand their archetype. What archetype do they represent? Because the whole point of archetype study is to understand balance and holism. You don't want to have a system that's missing parts. It would be like trying to drive a car without any wheels. So you want wheels on the car, right? So you don't analyze the wheel out of the context of the car in which it functions. Or else you won't understand what the wheel is used for. So you have to put it back on the car and see it in operation. Oh, that's what the wheel is for. Otherwise you wouldn't know. You just hang it from a tree using a rope and think it's a swing, Anyway, the tire at any rate. So let's see, what did we leave out? The hydrogen peroxide. So the silver hydroperoxide taken together is sattva. Because both are purifying, both are progressive, both are healing. But together they make a great team. So they represent sattva. So let's go over that again. Water represents water, Purusha. The mineral salts, in my case, Epsom salt and baking soda, represent the Rajoguna, the salt that Edgar Cayce had mentioned. The MSM represents tamas. In Edgar Cayce's version, it's baking soda. In the healing salve, it's oil. And the silver hydroperoxide represents the sattva guna. What Edgar Cayce would say is iodine, or what my healing salve was just silver soot, basically colloidal silver powder, if you prefer to call it that. I like to just call it silver soot because it looks like carbon soot, even though it's not soot. It has no relation to oxidized state. It just looks like soot, so I call it silver soot. But it's actually powdered colloidal silver is what it amounts to. And that's what I have in this healing salve, is powdered colloidal silver, making it dark. So that's all I wanted to talk about. I hope that helps explain where I'm heading here in the development of this technology surrounding silver usage. And it's very interesting, to put it mildly. Okay. Until next time.